Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into a world that's really just exploded in popularity, hasn't it? Indie horror games.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with online streaming. They're everywhere.
Yeah, countless hours of screams, jumps, lots of fun. But here's the twist, and this is interesting. For one fan we read about, the real terror isn't actually in the games.
Right. It's about who is watching them. That's the core concern.
Exactly. It's this kind of fascinating, maybe slightly uneasy shift, a genre that, let's be honest, often started pretty lighthearted, relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm. And now it's evolved into something, well, way more complex, and for some people, genuinely concerning. We're really looking at a big cultural shift here.
Totally. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that changing scene, the indie horror landscape. We're leaning heavily on Hadley Vincent's article from comicbook.com called "I'm Worried About the Current State of Indie Horror Games."
Yeah, it's a great piece.
It really is.
Yeah.
We want to figure out how this genre went from, like, all fun and games to grappling with these super dark, sometimes really disturbing themes.
And crucially, what that means for the audience, especially the younger viewers who might be stumbling across it, maybe unintentionally.
This should hopefully give you listening a clearer picture of something you might have seen, maybe as a player or a viewer on YouTube or Twitch, or even if you're a parent, kind of navigating this stuff.
Yeah, it brings up big questions like what actually makes something scary, and when does, dark content cross a line and become genuinely problematic for kids or teens, especially when it's just out there, so accessible.
Okay, so to get a handle on this shift, we kind of need to rewind, don't we? Think back to the early 2010s. Things felt different then. What was driving the indie horror boom back then?
Oh, that was absolutely the YouTube era for indie horror. You had these huge creators, PewDiePie, Markiplier, Corks Kenshin, Jacksepticeye, Manly Badass Hero.
The big names.
The biggest.
Yeah.
And they basically launched these games into the mainstream. People loved watching them play stuff like Amnesia, The Dark Descent, Ao Oni, The Cat Lady,
Cry of Fear, The Crooked Man.
Slender, the 8 pages. That was huge. Watching them scream became like this big shared thing online.
So what made those early games hit so hard? Was it just the jump scares? The novelty?
Well, the article argues pretty convincingly, I think, that back then it was mostly seen as all fun and games. It was kind of like tame horror, something almost all ages could get a kick out of.
Right.
The excitement was, screaming with your friends over these kind of jagged pixels jumping out. But everyone knew it was so clearly fiction, it felt safe, almost innocent, which feels, very different now.
That feeling of it being clearly fiction, though, that seems to have blurred quite dramatically. There was that awful Slender Man stabbing case, May 31st, 2014. That felt like a turning point.
It did. And it's really important how the article frames that. It stresses it was a one-off incident. It wasn't trying to say video games cause violence. Definitely not.
Okay, that's a key distinction.
But it was a huge cultural moment, wasn't it? A point where that line between digital horror and how people see things in the real world just got incredibly blurry, very publicly. And it was disturbing.
And right around that same time, 2014, we get the first Five Nights at Freddy's, FNF. The article calls it brilliant. It says it changed point-and-click horror forever. How did it do that? And what about its evolution?
Well, FNF was genuinely innovative. It had this unique mix, the jump scares, but also this really thick atmosphere and this surprisingly deep story, even if it was subtle at first. But that brilliance also kind of opened a door to darker stuff. As the series went on, what started as, scary robots,
Killer animatronics,
it quickly spiraled into this increasingly complicated lore. We're talking really macabre stories about dead children and a serial killer. That definitely pushed the boundaries of what felt like tame horror for a game that was, let's face it, massively popular with younger audiences, too.
And FNF basically spawned a whole new subgenre, right? This Mascot horror thing. Games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, Poppy Playtime.
Indigo Park, Finding Frankie. Yeah, they all followed that kind of stylistic path.
What's notable about Mascot horror, according to the article?
What's really striking is how it sort of shifted. It started moving away from horror aimed at adults, playing on childhood fears brought to life. And it drifted into a space where kids could and did easily jump in.
How so?
It wasn't just the cartoonish look, although that helped. The whole aesthetic seemed more kid-friendly, even when the stories underneath often kept or even ramped up the darker themes.
And the article points out this isn't just a gaming issue either. It brings up shows like Stranger Things and Fear Street on Netflix.
Exactly. It notes they have visual gore that shouldn't be consumed by young age groups, even though the school settings seem to directly target that demographic.
That really puts it in a wider context.
Yeah, and the comparison it makes is pretty stark. It says, older films that were originally rated R or 18 plus now look tame compared to what teens are watching.
Yeah.
It even suggests actual horror films aren't nearly as gory or dark as Stranger Things is.
Wow, that's a bold claim.
It really highlights how much our collective idea of what's mature content and what's okay for younger eyes has just escalated dramatically.
And it gets even heavier. The article mentions films like Blink Twice and Eden Lake R, or 15, rated apparently showing realistic rape and murder scenes. And there's this worry about the glamorization of trauma, drugs, sex, referencing shows like 13 Reasons Why and Euphoria.
And the argument is that this sort of desensitization, this normalization of extreme content is bleeding into indie horror too.
Which brings us right back to the nuance of darkness in modern indie horror and who's actually watching it. The article gives some really intense examples from just this year, 2024, on YouTube, like mouthwashing.
Yeah, that one sounds incredibly grim, playing as a monster character involved in sexual violence and its horrific aftermath.
Yeah, that's wow. And there were others mentioned too. Bad parenting.
Right. Bad parenting, you're the ghost of a boy murdered by his dad, and the trauma makes the dad appear as Mr. Redface. And the article describes it as involving a monster sexually abusing his daughter, using clear visual euphemisms for rape throughout. These are profoundly difficult themes.
Unbelievably so.
Yeah.
Yet the author, Hadley Vincent, says that as an adult, they love these dark indie horror games. They appreciate being disturbed by the subject matter, not just jump scares. It's a complex view.
It is, but they draw a very firm line stating flat out this content shouldn't be consumed by teens and never children.
Now, what's the core reason for that hard stance? Why the big difference?
It really boils down to how developing minds process this stuff. The article gives a really stark example from the Reddit page for mouthwashing.
Okay.
It says what was meant as this, like, morbid story showing the importance of standing up against something wrong, got totally twisted into a kind of fantasy by some younger viewers. Yeah, there was fan art sexualizing the protagonist, Jimmy, sometimes even showing him harming the victim, Anya, or seeing Anya not as the victim she clearly was, but as someone who, hated her unborn baby.
That completely misses the point. It's disturbing.
Exactly. It drives home the author's argument that young audiences cannot grasp the complexity of these darker themes because their mind works differently compared to adults. They just don't have the context, the life experience, the cognitive tools to unpack nuanced commentary versus, literal events or even twisted fantasy.
So it sounds like we've moved from horror being more subtle, more implicit, to being incredibly explicit. The article contrasts this with older games like Silent Hill, where you had to analyze to see it.
Right. Now, the article argues it's just out in the open. It mentions Fingerbones from 2014 back then, considered one of the most disturbing games because of its themes.
Yeah.
Now, those same kinds of themes are almost the norm, and they're not hidden away in notes you have to find. They're front and center. It seems like the lore, the story, has become increasingly more important in the indie horror sphere, and it's often pushing those boundaries much more overtly.
Okay, so if this trend is happening, and it's potentially harmful, who's responsible? The article seems careful here. It says, the fault for this trend lies in all parties involved, but they're not to be directly blamed. That feels like an important distinction. Shared responsibility, not finger-pointing.
Exactly. It avoids direct blame and looks at the different players. Take YouTubers. The article gets that they need to pay the bills, right? And they shouldn't be forced to play child-friendly content exclusively. There's amazing adult horror out there.
But then there's YouTube itself. The article points out this kind of irony.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. YouTube cracks down hard on swearing, but seems much looser on stuff like child abuse, sexual assault, cannibalism, and trauma-coded scenes with visual euphemisms. The article calls these rampant and getting more popular. And it even uses Quirks Kenshin as an example, someone who tries to follow the rules. But the content available, the stuff getting popular, has just gotten darker. It's not necessarily his fault, the author notes.
And what about the developers, the people actually making these games?
That's another critical piece. Sustainability. There's this worry that indie horror devs often aren't making what they need to survive, even when their games get massive views on YouTube.
So exposure doesn't equal income.
Not always. The article mentions Puppet Combo and Chilla's art, huge view counts on YouTube, but next to no reviews on Steam for some games. It suggests a disconnect, maybe a broken model, where creators aren't always benefiting from the free exposure.
Okay, so if direct blame isn't the answer, and it's this tangled web, what are the potential solutions? Does the article offer anything practical?
It does float one specific idea that content creators could maybe censor content when it's so obviously not meant to be viewed by younger audiences.
How would they know?
The article suggests they do know. They have analytics, they know their viewership percentages, including how many of their subscribers are young. So the information is there to make more informed choices about, say, blurring certain scenes or giving stronger warnings.
Interesting. Using the data they already have.
Exactly. And it's not all doom and gloom. The article wraps up that section on a more hopeful note. It points to some really positive examples. Indie horror games that handle dark psychological stuff beautifully, like We Harvest Shadows.
Okay.
Or games exploring cosmic horror or mystery, like Static Dread or No, I'm Not a Human. These show that compelling, mature horror doesn't have to rely on just explicit shock value. It reinforces the idea that, yeah, maybe the really disturbed content should stay in the adult world where it belongs.
Wow. Okay, that was quite the deep dive into this really, unsettling but super important trend in indie horror. We've traced how it went from those kind of fun jump scare fests
Clearly fictional, yeah.
to something way more complex, often deeply disturbing, with mature themes that used to be maybe hidden in the subtext, now just right there, explicit.
And the knock-on effect, maybe unintended, is this really graphic, complex stuff reaching younger viewers who just aren't equipped to process it, leading to, weird misinterpretations, blurring lines that used to feel much clearer.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening, whether you're a gamer, a parent, just someone trying to make sense of the online world? It's moving so fast. How can we, collectively build a digital space where artists can create freely in mature genres, developers can actually make a living from their amazing work,
Yeah.
but where younger people are still shielded from potentially harmful stuff? And importantly, how do we do that without just resorting to, heavy-handed censorship?
Yeah, what's the role of individual responsibility here for the creators, the parents, the platforms like YouTube, even for us as viewers? How do we find that balance? It's a really tough question, isn't it? It's something to definitely mull over.